What would you do if a 10-year-old boy in taped-up sneakers told you he could heal your child? And he was right. It was a chilly morning in Lexington, Kentucky. Not quite freezing, but cold enough to bite at your fingers and leave your breath visible in the air. People moved briskly in and out of the St. Mary's Pediatric Center on Maple Avenue, wrapped in thick coats and clinging to coffee cups like lifelines, moving with the urgency of those trying to outrun grief. But one boy wasn't moving. He sat on a flattened cereal box near the sliding glass doors, quietly sketching in a tattered notebook. His name was Micah Mick Dawson, just 10. His jacket hung from his shoulders like it once belonged to someone else, sleeves rolled several times, and one of his sneakers was patched up with layers of electrical tape. A wool hat sagged over his eyebrows, barely clinging to his head. He didn't ask for anything, didn't speak unless someone spoke first. He was just there, almost every Saturday. At first, the nurses tried to move him along, but over time they stopped. Mick wasn't a nuisance. He always smiled politely, always quiet, always watching. Most assumed his mother or brother was somewhere inside the hospital. Maybe he was waiting for a ride. But no one asked. Not in a place like that. Across the street, idling next to a yellow curb, a deep blue Audi hummed steadily. The headlights were on, but the man behind the wheel barely moved. His name was Robert Langston, just past 45, face drawn, stubble on his jaw, his blazer slumped over the passenger seat. His shoes were polished, but his eyes were tired. There was money there. You could tell from the car, the watch, the careful tailoring of his shirt, but money didn't fix everything. In the back seat, his daughter Emory, 7 years old, hair braided neatly to the side, lay curled under a quilted throw. Her gaze was blank, her silence louder than any scream. 1 month earlier, a fall from a backyard swing had left her unable to move from the waist down. Robert opened the back door, cradled her gently, and walked toward the hospital entrance. He didn't see Mick right away. Most people didn't. But Mick saw him. He noticed how Robert's arms tightened protectively, how Emory stared not at the hospital, but straight up into the clouds. Mick's eyes followed them as they passed. Then, without warning, he stood and spoke. "Mister, I can help her walk again." Robert froze. Not because the words were strange, but because of how they were said. Not mocking, not hopeful, just calm, certain, like the boy believed it with everything he had. Robert turned, his voice low. "What did you just say?" Mick stepped closer, notebook under one arm, and didn't blink. "I said I can help her walk again." Robert stared hard at the boy, holding Emory a little tighter. "That's not something to joke about, kid." "I'm not joking." Mick's voice was steady. There was no grin, no nervous twitch, just that calm, steady tone, like he was older on the inside than he looked. Robert took in the boy's worn-out coat, the taped sneaker, the smudged glasses looped on his collar. It felt off. Maybe a coincidence. Maybe someone using the hospital as a stage for tricks. Without another word, he turned and walked through the automatic doors. But something in the way the kid had spoken stayed with him. Not hopeful, not desperate. Certain. It clung to him through every appointment that morning. The physical therapy session, the neurologist's soft-spoken report, the occupational specialist listing out adaptive tools. All of them said what they always said. Adjust expectations. It's a process. Progress takes time. But none of that drowned out the voice in his head. I can help her walk again. It echoed, uninvited and unrelenting. By early afternoon, Robert stepped out into the brisk sunlight with Emory resting against his chest. The air was just as biting, but brighter now. He made his way to the car, adjusting the quilt around her shoulders, when he spotted Mick again. Still seated on the same piece of cardboard. Still clutching his notebook. This time, though, the boy's gaze was locked on Robert, as if he'd known he would come back. Robert hesitated. He looked down at Emory, her face turned inward, breath soft, eyelids fluttering like she was dreaming. She was too light in his arms, too still. He turned and walked over. "You again," he muttered, not hiding his frustration. "Why would you say something like that? You think this is some kind of joke?" Mick's head moved side to side. No, sir. Robert clenched his jaw. You don't even know her, he said sharply, placing Emory carefully into her booster seat. You have no idea what she's gone through, what we've gone through. Mick didn't step back. I don't need to know her to help. Robert stood upright. What are you, 10? Almost 11. You're a kid sitting outside a children's hospital with tape on your shoes. What makes you think you can help someone like her? Mick lowered his eyes for the first time, fingers brushing along the frayed edge of his sketchbook. My mom used to help people walk, he said, voice low but firm. She worked as a rehab therapist, Mick said softly. She used to show me things. Told me the body holds on to memories, even when it forgets, just for a while. Robert stared at him, the doubt pressing harder in his chest. So what? You watched her do some stretches and now you think you're qualified to treat someone? Mick didn't blink. I saw her help a man stand after 5 years in a wheelchair, he said, raising his eyes. No fancy gear, no assistance, just her hands, her patience, and her belief that he could. Robert started to speak, but hesitated. He glanced around. A nurse walked past and gave Mick a gentle nod. A hospital custodian pushing a mop offered the boy a quick wave. They all seemed to recognize him. I'm not handing you any cash, Robert muttered. Didn't ask for any, Mick replied. Then what are you after? Mick drew in a breath and took a step closer. Just 60 minutes. Let me show you. Robert looked over his shoulder at Emory. Her eyes were open now, quietly observing the two of them. He exhaled, fingers pressing into the bridge of his nose. I should just leave right now. Mick stood still. Or maybe I call the front desk and have them remove you, Robert added. The boy didn't flinch. After a long pause, Robert shook his head. Fine. You want to waste both our time? Be at Crescent Hill Park tomorrow at noon. Not a minute late. Mick gave a single nod. I'll be there. Robert climbed into the Audi, turned the ignition, and pulled away without another word. But in the rearview mirror, the boy hadn't moved. He remained by the entrance, arms at his sides, expression impossible to read. That night, after dinner, Robert sat alone in his study. Papers, charts, and reports littered his desk, none of them offering answers. His mind kept drifting to that boy, how he stood there, like he knew something no one else did. From the hallway, Emory peeked in. Dad? He turned toward her. Yeah, honey. She stepped further into the room. Who was that kid? Robert paused. Just someone we met outside the clinic. He looked like he meant it, she said. Meant what? That I could walk. He looked at her, caught off guard by the certainty in her tone. She gave a soft smile and tapped her fingers along the side of her wheelchair, mimicking footsteps. Robert didn't return the smile, because for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel empty. It felt risky, like believing again. Willow Glen Park wasn't the kind of place anyone lingered. A faded basketball hoop with a crooked rim, a couple of rusted swings that creaked in the wind, and a scruffy patch of grass pretending to be a soccer field. By midday on Sundays, it was usually deserted. But that day, Mick was already waiting, seated on the bench under the tallest sycamore. He wore the same baggy coat, but his sketchpad was nowhere in sight. Instead, a small duffel sat at his feet, and a neatly folded towel was beside him. At 12:07, Robert's car rolled into the gravel lot. He didn't speak at first, just lifted Emory from the back seat and settled her gently into her chair. With a silent push, he wheeled her over to where Mick sat. His eyes didn't meet the boy's. Arms folded tight across his chest, his posture said this was a mistake. Mick stood as they approached. Hi again, he greeted with quiet politeness. Robert gave a curt nod. Emory raised her hand in a small wave. Mick's smile warmed. Hey, Emory. Her eyes lit slightly. Hi. Robert's brow lifted. How do you know her name? You said it yesterday, Mick replied simply. I remember things. Robert didn't answer, just motioned toward the towel. So what now? You gonna float her on a cloud? Mick let the sarcasm slide. No, sir. Just starting with the basics. He crouched and opened the bag, pulling out a rolled pair of clean socks, a worn tennis ball, a small tin of cocoa salve, and a plastic container holding something wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of jasmine and starch. Robert narrowed his eyes. And this stuff is... Things my mom used, Mick said. The warm pack helps loosen up stiff muscles. The ball's for pressure therapy. Robert crossed his arms tighter. Mick turned to Emory. If it's all right, can I work with your legs a bit? I promise nothing will hurt. And if anything doesn't feel right, just tell me to stop. Okay? Emory looked up at her dad. He sighed and nodded. Go ahead, but be gentle. Mick knelt beside her wheelchair and carefully pulled the quilt away from her legs. He placed the heated cloth bundle over her thighs. She flinched. Too hot? He asked quickly. She shook her head. No, it feels kind of nice. Mick gave a small nod and waited, giving the warmth time to soak in. Then, slowly and deliberately, he began moving her legs. Nothing abrupt, nothing strained. Just small, patient motions. Slight turns, careful lifts, light stretches. Robert stood stiffly nearby, his eyes locked on every movement, ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. But there was none. Have you actually done this before? Robert asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Mick didn't glance up. My mom used to bring me to clinics and shelters after school. She worked with veterans and people who couldn't afford therapy. Said everyone deserves a chance to feel whole again. I used to carry her stuff. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. And she taught you all this? Yeah, Mick said simply. Told me you don't always need fancy equipment, just care. He gently tapped Emory's knee with a knuckle. Can you feel that? No, she said softly. Mick nodded without missing a beat. That's okay. I'll keep checking. As he continued the slow movements with her legs, he kept the conversation going, asking her about her favorite ice cream, favorite cartoon characters, what she liked to draw. At first her replies were barely more than a word or two, but gradually she began asking him things too. Do you live nearby? Sort of. Do you go to school? I used to. Why don't you anymore? Mick hesitated for a beat. My mom got sick. She passed. I've been figuring stuff out since. Emory looked down. I'm sorry. He gave her a gentle smile. Thanks. Robert's stance shifted slightly, less rigid, but he kept quiet. After about half an hour, Mick tapped the side of her ankle again. Anything now? Emory blinked. A little, she murmured. Like pressure. Mick looked up at Robert. That's a good sign. Robert frowned, skeptical. She's mentioned that during her regular sessions before. Sure, Mick replied. But those sessions happen in rooms full of blinking lights and whirring gadgets. Kids get tense around that. They hold back. Out here. He motioned toward the quiet, open space. There's sky, wind, space to breathe. That matters. Robert didn't respond, but it was clear he was paying attention. Mick guided Emory through more stretches, then encouraged her to try wiggling her toes. Just small movements, no expectations. She gave it a shot. Nothing noticeable happened, but she didn't seem discouraged. We can go over it again next week, Mick said, rising to his feet. Takes time, but your muscles? He gestured gently to her thighs. They still remember how to work. You just have to remind them. Emory's smile widened. Okay. Robert cleared his throat. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, he said quickly. Mick nodded. I'm not making promises. Just doing what I can. Robert looked at him for a long second, then unexpectedly reached into his coat, pulled out a folded bill, and held it out. Mick stepped back. No, sir, I'm not here for money. Robert looked caught off guard. Then why are you doing this? Mick gave a slight shrug. Because she smiled. Robert turned his gaze to Emory. She was still smiling, soft, content. But he couldn't make sense of how a kid who'd clearly been through so much could offer so much light to someone he barely knew. The next Sunday brought warmer weather, but Mick still wore the same coat, not for the cold, but because it reminded him of his mother. She used to call it his helper's jacket. said every real healer should carry something that reminded them why they care. By 11:45, Mick was already at Willow Glen Park. The towel was spread neatly across the bench, supplies arranged in order, and a half-full bottle of water sat beside his bag. A few kids were shooting hoops nearby, and the distant bark of a dog echoed through the stillness. At exactly noon, Robert's car eased into the lot. Emory was grinning before the tires had even stopped rolling. Mick raised a hand. "Hi, Emory." "Hi," she called out, her curls bouncing as Robert lifted her into the wheelchair. Robert looked tired again, but not in the same way. There was something lighter about him now. He gave Mick a quiet nod, no words exchanged, but it meant more than last time. Mick began like before, same cloth-wrapped warm pack over her thighs, same calm instructions, but something had shifted. Emory wasn't just sitting passively now. She was trying. "Can you press your heel into the ground?" Mick asked gently. Emory closed her eyes, focusing hard. Nothing moved. "That's all right," Mick reassured. "Sometimes your brain's just trying to find the road again. Like getting through a crowded hallway, you just have to keep pushing through." Robert stood behind them, arms crossed again, but this time more for warmth than defensiveness. "Why do you really do this?" he asked, unexpectedly. Mick glanced up. "Because I remember how people looked when my mom helped them, like they mattered again. I want to help people feel like that." Robert nodded slowly. "You ever think about doing something else?" Mick gave a faint smile. "Sometimes, but this feels like what I'm supposed to be doing." Robert's eyes moved to Emory. She was tapping her toes. Barely, but there was movement for the first time. He didn't say a word. He just watched. In the weekends that followed, they kept returning. Same spot, same hour. Mick showed Emory how to loop resistance bands to build strength in her ankles. He rolled tennis balls under her soles to retrain the nerves. He guided Robert through pressure massage behind the knees and explained how nerves have memory, even when they've gone silent. And then, one weekend, came the day things didn't go right. It was the fourth Sunday. Mick arrived just like he always did. But when Robert's car pulled into the lot, Emory wasn't smiling. Her eyes were puffy, rimmed in red. Robert's expression was tight, his movements sharp. "She doesn't want to do it today," he said curtly, lifting her into the chair with more effort than usual. Emory avoided both their eyes. Mick approached carefully. "What happened?" She folded her arms. "I tried to move my legs this morning, and nothing. Her voice cracked. "I'm tired of trying. It doesn't work. It's useless." Robert turned his face away, jaw clenched. "She's been frustrated all weekend." Mick gave a small nod and knelt beside her once again. "You think I don't get tired?" She didn't respond. "You think I didn't cry in a corner of a shelter when my mom couldn't afford her medicine and I had to just sit there and watch her get worse?" Her eyes shifted toward his. "You're allowed to be angry," he said gently. "I get angry too. But if you quit now, that part of you that still wants to walk might stop trying too." She stared down at the dirt. "I don't want you to quit," Mick added, softer this time. "Because I haven't." A long silence stretched out between them. Then, in a whisper, Emory said, "I'm scared." Robert turned around. It was the first time she'd ever said that aloud. Mick leaned closer. "Me too. But being scared doesn't mean stop. It means you're close to something that matters." Emory wiped her face with her sleeve. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's try again." And they did. Mick took her through the usual motions, but slower this time, with fewer words. Just calm, just presence. Robert joined in more than he had before, helping her shift her balance, speaking encouragement with every tiny twitch. Then, after about half an hour, something happened. Emory's right foot moved. Not just a toe, her entire foot slid forward. Stiff, awkward, but undeniably hers. Robert dropped to one knee, eyes wide. "Do that again," he said. She did. Mick didn't say anything. He just leaned back and watched. That night, Robert stood outside his house on Oak Ridge Lane, eyes fixed on the moon overhead. He'd stopped asking himself who Mick really was. The answer didn't matter anymore. Inside, Emory was laughing, really laughing, recounting her foot's movement to her aunt on speakerphone. For the first time in half a year, their house didn't feel like a recovery ward. It felt like home. But something else had started to shift too, not just in Emory's legs, but in Robert. The heaviness he'd been dragging for months, the shame, the pressure, the invisible wall that kept him sealed off, was beginning to crack. By Monday afternoon, Robert was at his office desk, staring at a contract he hadn't touched. His phone buzzed every few minutes with calls, updates, reminders. But none of it seemed urgent. What played over and over in his mind was the image of Emory's foot sliding forward, reclaiming something that had felt lost. He'd witnessed it with his own eyes. And the person who helped make it happen wasn't a specialist or a therapist. It was a kid in worn-out shoes, carrying a notebook and no last name he recognized. He opened his laptop, opened a new tab, and typed in Micah Dawson Lexington. Nothing concrete came up, just a few mentions in old-school newsletters and community bulletins, brief references to a Mick and his mother, a woman named Camille Dawson, who once volunteered at a local outreach clinic. No current address, no records, no social media. He closed the laptop slowly and leaned back in his chair. The kid might as well have been a ghost, except he wasn't a ghost. By the following Saturday, they were back at Willow Glen Park, but things had shifted. Robert brought along an extra yoga mat and a folding chair. When they arrived, he handed Mick a sandwich, didn't say a word about it, just set it beside the duffel bag. Mick gave a quiet, thanks, and tucked it away for later. "You ready, Emory?" he asked. She gave a big thumbs up. "Let's do it." They slipped into their usual rhythm, warm compresses, gentle stretches, toe mobility drills. But this time, Robert was fully in. He sat cross-legged in the grass, mirroring every move. Mick gave instructions, occasionally correcting him. "You're bending the wrong way," he said with a grin. Robert shot him a look. "I haven't stretched since the Clinton administration." They all laughed, even Emory. Around 20 minutes in, Mick reached into his bag and pulled out a cloth belt. "Let's try something new today," he said. He looped the belt under Emory's knees and showed Robert how to hold each end. "She's going to try to lift both legs, just a bit. We stabilize, she drives the movement." Robert hesitated. "You sure?" Mick nodded. "She's ready." They gave her a moment to focus, her brow furrowed, lips tight. Then came a soft grunt, and slowly her knees lifted, just an inch, but they moved. Robert's eyes widened. "You did that," Emory beamed. "I did it," he swallowed, blinking hard. "You really did." Mick gave a small nod, eyes focused on the belt. "Told you. The body doesn't forget. It just needs patience to speak again." Robert looked at him for a long moment. "You're something else, kid." Mick didn't reply. He simply guided Emory into the next stretch. After the session, as they packed up, Robert crouched beside him. "So, where do you go when you leave here?" Mick shrugged. "Around." Robert lowered his voice. "Do you have a place to sleep?" Mick paused, then said, "Sometimes." Robert let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Ever think about staying with us?" "Just for a while." Mick's eyes widened. "You serious?" "I've got a guest room. You wouldn't be a bother." Mick looked down at his hands. "You sure your neighbors won't care about a kid like me?" Robert gave a short laugh. "After what you've done for my daughter, they can keep their opinions to themselves." Mick didn't answer right away, but something was clearly shifting behind his eyes. The next morning, he stood at Robert's front steps, backpack slung over one shoulder, a rolled-up blanket under his arm. Robert answered the door in sweats, a coffee mug in hand. "Right on time," he said. Emory came skidding into the hallway. "Mick," he smiled. "Hey, superstar." Robert stepped aside. "Welcome home." The days that followed were quiet, but full. Mick had his own room. A real bed, clean sheets, a small desk. He didn't talk much, But he never missed a single morning stretch with Emory. She was moving both feet now, still in the chair, but her body was waking up piece by piece. Her brain was reaching down to her legs like it was finally remembering they belonged to her. One evening, as Robert stood at the sink scrubbing plates, he paused and rested his hands on the edge of the counter. "Mick," he said over his shoulder, "you ever think about going back to school?" Mick, who was seated at the kitchen table sketching something in his notebook, glanced up. "Sometimes?" Robert gave a thoughtful nod. "You're a sharp kid. You could really do something with that brain of yours." Mick tilted his head. "I just want to help people walk again, like my mom used to." Robert turned, drying his hands with a towel. "Then let's figure out how to make that happen." Mick offered a soft smile. "Okay." That was it. They didn't say much more. They didn't need to. But for the first time in a long time, the Langston house wasn't cloaked in quiet. It was alive with the sounds of pencils scratching on paper, occasional laughter, footsteps down the hall, and something deeper: healing. It all started with a nurse from St. Mary's, who was out walking her dog through Willow Glen Park early one Sunday. She paused when she saw a familiar child, Emory. She hadn't seen her out of her chair in months, much less lifting her knees or flexing her toes, and definitely not grinning. Beside her was a boy the nurse recognized too, the quiet one who used to sit near the hospital entrance every weekend, sketchbook in hand. She didn't say anything, just watched from afar for a while, then went home and told her sister, who worked in outpatient services. A few days later, one of the hospital's physical therapists mentioned to Robert, "Hey, I heard Emory's making real progress. That true?" Robert gave a small smile. "Yeah, thanks to someone we didn't see coming." Word spread quickly. The following Sunday, when they arrived at the park, 2 other families were already waiting near the big sycamore. One had a young boy using a walker. The other brought a girl recovering from a stroke. Both had heard whispers about a kid who'd helped a girl move her legs again. Mick glanced at Robert, uncertain. Robert met his eyes. "You don't have to," he said gently. Mick tightened the strap on his duffel. "I want to." That day, instead of his usual session with Emory, he worked with the 2 new kids. He showed their parents how to prepare simple heat packs, how to gently stretch with towels, how to encourage without overwhelming. But more than that, he spoke directly to the children, never down to them. "You're not broken," he told one of them. "You're just finding your own kind of strong." Emory watched it all from her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't protest once. Later, on the way home, she looked out the window and said, "I like watching him help other kids." Robert glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Yeah?" She nodded. "It makes me feel like I'm part of something good." He smiled to himself. The next weekend, 5 families showed up. The weekend after that, there were 11. A local church leader even brought folding chairs. A nearby cafe started dropping off bagels and thermoses of coffee. Someone printed flyers that read, "Free mobility sessions, Sundays at noon, Willow Glen Park." They didn't list Mick's name, but everyone already knew who it was about. One weekend, a local journalist arrived, camera slung over her shoulder, notepad in hand. Robert pulled Mick aside. "You okay with all this?" Mick looked out across the park, at the families setting up mats, at the kids stretching limbs, at Emory laughing with a girl balancing on a walker. He nodded. "As long as it's not about me, it's about them." The article ran on page 2 of the Lexington Weekly Gazette under the title, "10-Year-Old with Healing Hands Inspires a City Park Revival." They kept his last name out, just as he'd asked. But word spread anyway. A physician from a local clinic offered to mentor him. A nonprofit reached out, offering to sponsor adaptive equipment. A retired teacher volunteered free tutoring. For the first time since losing his mom, people didn't just glance at Mick. They really saw him. But Mick didn't let it change him. Every Sunday, he still rolled out his towel the same way, still wore those worn sneakers with the taped sole, still checked in with Emory first before helping anyone else. The park, once quiet and tentative, had become something else entirely, a space filled with motion, hope, and community. and the boy with no fixed address had somehow become the center of something larger than himself. It had been 9 Sundays, 9 weeks of soft instructions and small breakthroughs, of Emory lifting her knees higher, of strangers becoming a kind of chosen family. But this Sunday felt different. Mick sensed it even before they turned into the park. The air was warmer. The breeze moved like a whisper. Even Emory, usually bubbling with chatter, sat unusually still in the back seat, as if gearing up for something she hadn't named aloud. When they arrived, a quiet crowd had already gathered. Nothing flashy, just folding chairs, therapists on mats, parents with eyes full of maybe. At the heart of it all, beneath the same old sycamore, sat the familiar worn bench. Mick didn't say anything at first. He just unpacked his bag, laid the towel out like he always did, and looked at Emory. "Ready?" She nodded. No smile, just that steady, determined expression. Robert wheeled her onto the mat. Mick knelt down in front of her. "Same as always," he said softly. "We help you rise. The rest is yours." Robert moved behind her, hands gently supporting under her arms. Mick positioned her legs, careful and precise. "Okay," Mick breathed. "On 3. Emory shut her eyes. 1, 2, 3. Robert lifted. Mick held steady at her knees, and then for the first time, Emory stood. Her legs trembled, arms quivered, but she was standing, on her own 2 feet. The entire park went still. A few kids let out tiny gasps. One mother covered her mouth, eyes wide. Emory slowly opened her eyes, the corners of her mouth curling up. "I'm standing," she whispered. Mick blinked rapidly, something stinging at the corners of his eyes. "Yeah," he said softly. "You are." Robert stood frozen, chest tight, like the air had vanished. Then, slowly, he let go, and she stayed up. He took a step back, hands shaking. She's doing it." Mick stepped back too, just a touch. "She's been doing it." Emory took a shaky step. Then another. And then, because she was only 6, and brave enough not to know fear, she took a 3rd step completely on her own, before toppling into her father's arms. He caught her mid-laugh, mid-tears, hands trembling as he pulled her in. "You did it," he whispered, voice breaking. "You really did it." Emory turned toward Mick. "You said I could." He gave her a small smile. "I said we'd try." That afternoon, no one was in a rush to leave the park. People lingered, hugging, sharing stories, even praying. Mick sat back on the bench beneath the sycamore, watching it all unfold. Quiet, like always. Later that evening, back at the house, Robert stood in the kitchen while Mick poured cereal into a bowl. "You know you changed everything," he said. Mick didn't look up, but Emory did, her smile still hanging on from earlier. Robert stepped closer and rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "My daughter walked today," he said, voice low. "And not because of a specialist or some miracle procedure. She walked because a kid with duct-taped sneakers kept showing up, over and over, without being asked." Mick gave a small nod. "That's what my mom would have done." Robert swallowed hard. "I wish she could have seen this." Mick finally looked up, his voice soft. "She did. I think she still does." Robert wiped at his eyes, then said, almost a whisper, "Mick, you're going to change a lot of lives." The boy looked at him, calm and sure. "I already am." The truth is, there are people in this world who may not have degrees, credentials, or polished pasts, but they carry something deeper: grit, compassion, and the strength to keep showing up when no one else does. Sometimes it's the ones who've been through the most who end up holding the keys to someone else's healing. If this story moved something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. And if you know a kid like Mick or a girl like Emory, tell them this: you matter, you're needed, and your time isn't over.